My guest today is someone whose work I've followed for many years. He has been single-handedly responsible for assuring people that just because you're an anarchist doesn't mean you're not debonair and doesn't mean you don't own a bow tie. His explanation of things to do with liberty is always refreshing, and it carries with it a gentleness that makes him stand out in even in that particular area of thought. So I'm welcoming today Jeffrey Tucker, president of the Brownstone Institute. Jeffrey, welcome.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
I'd like to start with the Brownstone Institute, because this was a response, as I understand it, to COVID and the COVID lockdown and the COVID tyranny and the COVID lies. And this is something that's very dear to the heart of the UK column and our audience, because this is what gave us a huge impetus and a huge growth, because we started to explore this, and we found the state narrative utterly unsound, but it was enforced with such arrogance and such power and such authoritarianism, and we recognised what we were dealing with as deeply unsettling, deeply evil, and deeply deceptive. So our pushback, perhaps like yours, became very fact-based. It became very much looking at the stats, looking at the information, and questioning the narrative. Now, very quickly we became aware of the Brownstone Institute and the excellent material you're publishing on, not just on COVID, but in a wide range of things. Could you take us through, why you set up the Brownstone Institute and what you're looking to achieve?
The lockdowns were a real change in the matrix in many ways. It was a shift in world history. I think something like the equivalent of how I imagine World War I was for that generation, something that was completely unexpected, far more brutal, far more vast than we ever knew. And it unleashed all sorts of forces and devils that we thought were long ago put away. And for me, intellectually, it was a shock. I had been writing about pandemic responses for about 15 years. So I knew that this cockamamie idea of lockdowns in the event of a pandemic was out there. And I had written about this a lot over the previous 15 years. In fact, my first book called Bourbon for Breakfast has a chapter on pandemic responses. But it's one thing to know intellectually something like that is possible. It's like knowing nuclear war is possible, but you still don't expect it. So when the pandemic response began, which to my mind, it really began on March 8th in the U.S., but it was foretold about 10 days earlier with an interview in the New York Times for the New York Times. It contradicted 100 years of public health advice by advocating panic. I knew that something had changed, and I knew that the world would never be the same, and that I would never be the same. Speaking from an intellectual point of view, I had become burrowed down progressively over many years in a kind of, I guess I would call it maybe techno-utopianism. I really had come to believe that the advent of digital media would lead to an information explosion, and this information explosion would cause the public to be ever more educated about the merits of liberty, and with the rise of big tech, we would have a new generation of entrepreneurs who would fall in love with the market and with the idea of human rights and human liberty and free speech, and so on. So I had made exactly the same mistake that many Victorian liberals had in the 1880s and 1890s, which was believing somehow that our victory was inevitable. The problem with that perspective is that you tend to see the world through this intellectual constructs that you've built for yourself. I had. You said, well, I was excessively optimistic, I would say, and ignoring, actual threats all around us, and which appalls me. I mean, my one job in this world is to make good calls, and to understand the world around me. I mean, that's what I do. And so I had completely failed And it was in light of this failure that I decided to kind of reboot. And the reason I started Brownstone was because I wanted to focus on this dramatic historical shift and everything that would represent. I knew from the very beginning that this would lead to enormous economic, cultural, and political fallout that would last. Basically, I knew for as long as I'm on this earth. I mean, it was that kind of change. And so I wanted an institute that would grapple with this, understand what happened, and provide some guidance on the way out of it as best I possibly can. And that was the purpose of Brownstone. I didn't see any other institution set up with the capability of doing that. And that's why Brownstone doesn't have a specific ideological framework. It doesn't have a limit in the types of topics we talk about, and nor do we have a set, dogmatic agenda. I want it to be objective. As you said in your opening, you became very fact-based, and so I want to be fact-based. I don't want to. So there are two kinds of errors I want to repeat: the kind of error that led to lockdowns for the world, but I don't want to repeat the error that I myself personally made, which was, believing optimistically in the inevitable triumph of my ideas, and thereby causing me to neglect all the threats around me. So it was, for me, a kind of an awakening.
I understand what you mean about the throwing away of 100 years of medical practice. I actually put this to a consultant in the NHS in Britain. So, watching what you do, it was very, very odd, because you've spent 150 years understanding how best to deal with sick people, right? How best to prepare them for an operation, how best to have them recover from an operation, how to do each little part of it a little bit better until you get to the best practice you can. And COVID came along, and I said, from where I stand, you panicked and threw it all away. And you started to make it up on the hoof, because this was just so different, so scary. Nothing was good enough. And he basically said, yeah, we did rather do that. That's true. And panic is the right word. You used that.
I don't think we understood the capability of, well, let me just say this. I thought the human experience was very good at incorporating past knowledge and bringing it towards the future in ever better ways, and that proved not to be true in very specific ways about which we can speak.
Yes, well, let's get back to that in just a moment, because I'd like to explore the liberalism point that you made, because I'll quote from your Brownstone Institute website. You say the name Brownstone originates from the malleable, long-lasting building stone, also known as freestone, used so commonly in 19th century American cities, preferred for its beauty, practicality, and strength. Brownstone Institute regards the great task of our times as rebuilding the foundations of liberalism, as classically understood, including core values of human rights and freedom as non-negotiables for an enlightened society.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, what happened? What went wrong to those principles? Because those principles were dominant at one point. They were dominant in the British Empire. They were dominant in America. They were dominant across Europe. And then all of a sudden they weren't, and they were historic. And they were an artifact of the past, and they were swept away. And to rebuild them, I understand why you would want to do that. What's the analysis of why it needs rebuilt? Why did it collapse?
Our ancestors always told us that the idea of human rights and freedom need to be taught in every generation. And I've read that line for my whole life, from Thomas Jefferson to, I don't know, Cicero to Lord Acton, but it's an interesting point, because it means that society has to have a cognition of what it is doing, the purposes, that freedom has to be the primary end of politics, as Lord Acton said. and that we have to understand this. And when we forget that, then the foundations become very vulnerable. And clearly, I mean, there's no dispute about this. By 2020, something had gone out of those foundations. I had been chronicling this for years, but I never really believed that the sort of cultural and intellectual loss of an appreciation for what freedom is and how it works and why it's important would have such a practical impact on the world. But it did. I mean, when the lockdowns came, at least in the U.S. experience, I was screaming. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. On March 8th, this conference called South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, was canceled by the mayor. This is a conference that involved 250,000 people. And their plane tickets are shredded. All their expenses, the hotel reservations, all the expenses associated with exhibitors were canceled. It was all just banned, by executive edict by the mayor. And I watched that unfold. This is before the generalized lockdown, so it's just a local lockdown. I saw this unfold, and I thought, well, this is a scandal for the ages. We're going to see a decade of lawsuits. That we're never going to get over this. And I wrote an article about it, and to my astonishment, I had the only article that I saw in the entire American press about this, really, the entire world. And I thought we had a vast libertarian army, all over the U.S. and the world that would come out guns a-blazing and criticizing this. But instead, what we saw was complete silence, not just on the part of the libertarian intellectuals in general, especially the libertarians went silent, but the general public. It was like the fears overcame all principled attachments to all the things I thought we had a consensus on. So I was completely wrong. That consensus seems to have disappeared. And I don't know why. I think we just stopped teaching it. We stopped appreciating it. We were surrounded by the blessings and prosperity and became spoiled and thought it was just sort of baked into our lives that we would always have human rights and freedom and all the blessings of liberty, even if we never fought for it. And the other thing is that there were terrible academic trends that were taking over the academy for really decades prior to 2020. But I had convinced myself that this would never leak out into real life. The deconstructionists and the wackadoodles on campus, and their vicious worldview would never amount to anything. But I was wrong about that too. So there's a number of reasons, and we developed a kind of a Zoom class, ruling class in the U.S. and in the UK and around the world, that benefited enormously from the low interest rates for the previous 15 years. And they developed a kind of a lifestyle of 6-digit salaries with no work to do. And then we had the technologies for them to work at home. And basically they just said, screw society, screw human rights, forget freedom, make the working class serve me. And I'm just going to sit at home and pretend to work. And then you pay me lots of money. And that's the way life's supposed to be. So that drove a lot of why nobody really cared. I mean, and this is true even of libertarian intellectuals. They were thrilled. It's like, well, I'm special. I don't want to get infected, so I'm just going to sit at home and enjoy my high salaries. I mean, there are libertarian organizations that bragged about how they shut down their offices and they were sitting at home on their laptops, and they thought that was morally virtuous. I'll just order my groceries online, have some schlub bring it to me and drop it off at my front door. And let them get the virus. I'll stay safe. So there was a kind of a development of a caste system that fed into the lockdowns too.
I like the fact that little quote I gave from your website. It talks about core values, and this is what was lost, because we were in a society that we were always being told was neoliberal, right? We had rolled back the waves of communism. We had fought off socialism. We'd fought off totalitarianism. Liberalism had triumphed, And that wasn't entirely false, because if you look at the plummeting levels of poverty in the world, that was clearly associated with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberalization of China and the Pacific and Eastern Europe and indeed Russia. And there was certainly benefits. And we're being told that the ideas of liberalism, free trade, okay, maybe it wasn't all that free, but it was free air trade, free markets, free air markets for sure, that these had triumphed. And that, again, is not wholly a lie, but the underlying ideas, the core values that society had, were clearly miles from this. So we had the appearance of some sort of liberalism, but there was no heart to it. There was no substance to it. When in the city that gave birth to the Enlightenment, Edinburgh, when the lockdown came, there was a protest was called. I'm not saying it was necessarily just one man. There might have been a handful there, but it was pretty much one man turned up. It was Professor Richard Enos, and he was on his own, and he was obviously attacked by his university for being there. And the BBC sent a cameraman to kind of catch this terrible violator of the rules. And of course, the cameraman said, quietly to him, "I'm right with you. I think what you're saying is fantastic, but we can't show that on the BBC. We've got to get something that makes you look silly." Right? So they were sent down to take him down. Right? And there was a strange fear that went through almost the whole of society, and the number of people in the early days who would stand up and say no were very small. And then slowly it grew. One by one, people kind of refound their courage, and they started to share ideas, and they started to become less afraid. As I was saying before we went live, the UK column team went to a march in London. There was easily 750,000 people there. No mainstream media, but 750,000 people on the street saying no to lockdown. So eventually the pushback became huge. But the marches themselves were very interesting because people would go along and they'd go along in ones and twos. They'd go along in small groups. Often they went along on their own. And what they got from the march wasn't that they were protesting or being able to bring a message to those in power. What they got was a morale boost because, hey, I'm not alone. Because in their office, in their society, in their family, often they were. And I was speaking to one of the leaders of the movement against the woke in Scotland, who's fighting against educational reforms, which are indoctrination for children, not education. And they started a movement to push back against this. And initially, they thought they were being kind of set up by the opposition because when they were selling tickets, they were always going in ones. People weren't going and buying 3 and 4. It was single tickets, but hugely disproportionately. And they thought, well, is this an algorithm? Is something buying up our tickets so that no one turns up? But it wasn't that at all. It was people who were resisting and they were on their own, in their own little sliver of society, and they had to go out to find someone who actually thought the same way. So this grew slowly through the lockdown. I don't think that it's small now. I mean, what's your sense of this? You talked about this being a World War I level sea change in society. Do you see this as having awoken a much more independent spirit in our people, or at least in a sizable part of them?
It has, but it's not enough. We're nowhere near getting to the place we need to be. These are all rearguard actions so far. I mean, what we're seeing right now should have existed more than 3 years ago, and so we're very late to the game. And to realize the level of the hegemon. I mean, just one point that we are only now fully becoming aware of is the unity of media, big tech, and government in sort of marching in lockstep. So that was something that I didn't know had happened, but basically media and big tech had been in effect nationalized or corporatized over the many years prior to lockdowns, and I didn't know that was happening. So we're becoming aware of these things, but my concern is that, and it's true, we've seen some victories, right? We've seen the victories in rollback of vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and that sort of thing. They wanted to implement all that stuff. It didn't really work. The problem is what we see as victories, the hegemon, sees as temporary setbacks, temporary inevitable setbacks. So their plan is just to wait it out and then ramp it up again and change the topics. That's why we're seeing all the hysteria about climate change, right? I mean, it's all just like right on cue. So to keep us disoriented, but to prepare for another lockdown or another emergency. So while on one hand I'm very happy about the progress we've made, but we're nowhere near getting to the point that we need to be. Also, all of our channels of communication continue to be very vulnerable. YouTube is still taking down videos every day that are talking about these subjects. They're continuing to censor. We've got major lawsuits in the United States right now. It's probably going to be settled by the Supreme Court, dealing with whether and to what extent government can actually, cooperate with big tech in censoring and media and censoring citizens' voices. And the answer seems to be absolutely not. And it seems like the case is going to go our way. But what's strange is even while the case is being litigated and the discovery is finding all sorts of evidence of all this stuff and more every day, even while this is taking place, big tech and media continue to work directly with government agencies to censor. So we've got the very thing that the litigation is seeking to stop is continuing on with absolutely no change whatsoever. So they're clearly not intimidated by this. So it's going to take some profound efforts to stop this. And I'm with you. I'm thrilled that we now have an awakened global movement, but I don't know yet whether it's capable of stopping this. I wish this had happened 3 years ago, because the problems we're trying to defeat have advanced in very mighty ways, and we haven't really seen a mechanism in place to stop it.
The state direction of media was a thing to behold, because found that not only, particularly during lockdown, not only were all the media organisations getting government bailout money, but almost all of their advertising. So all the print media, the independent print media in the UK, almost all of their advertising was government advertising. There was huge amounts regarding COVID itself, and then there was huge amounts for recruitment ads for people. So it got to a point where they were so financially dependent on the state to have a different line, to actually say the lockdowns are harmful, and then the phone would go. And presumably the conversation would go something like, are you sure you want to take this line? That's very brave of you, but I'm not sure how this is going to affect, how we place advertising, because we couldn't really be seen to support that message. I'm sure it's not censorship, you understand. I'm sure you understand our position. So maybe could you have another look at that? Would a call like that not take place? I suspect it would, because what we saw was no opposition. And this is one of the dangers, because it is possible that there's a tipping point, and Britain, Scotland's worse than this than America. How much of the total economy has to be run by the state before the economic power that imparts to the state is so overwhelming that resistance, other than by the determined, principled few, becomes very hard? And as long as the economic power lasts, the power lasts. Is there something in that? Is what we're seeing we've thrown off communism because communism failed economically. It made people poor. The officials understand that under communism, officials were poor. So communism was swept away. and we've got something else in its place, and hey, they're not poor anymore. And that has brought the something else an ability to dictate that even the dictators of the past didn't have.
Yeah, it really is true. Communism was a kind of a wild experiment and a wacky idea. The corporatism that we're seeing rise in the West today is not so much an experiment, but a codification of a growing consolidation of industry, government, and media. So it's, and yes, you're right. It'll stop progress, but it's not going to bring poverty to the ruling class. The ruling class is doing just fine. I mean, there was a huge transfer of wealth that took place over 3.5 years, trillions and trillions of dollars sucked away from the middle class and transferred to the ruling class. And it was done through tremendous amounts of economic fakery. In the U.S., there were these stimulus payments that just out of nowhere, government started dropping thousands of dollars into people's bank accounts to pay them to stay locked down. And people celebrated. Like, well, this is very interesting. I've been paying the government all my life. Now the government's giving me free money. This doesn't get any better than this. But of course, within a year, the inflation started. And the inflation has in the case of the U.S. dollar, in 3 years, robbed every dollar of 17 cents. I mean, that's how severe it's been. Well, that more than takes away all the value of the stimulus payments themselves. So if you look at real disposable income, it's been flat over 4 years, and that's so the stimulus didn't give anybody money. It was just a bribe, and then the government just took it away. It was one of the great head fakes in history. And I still don't understand. I write about this all the time, but I still don't understand why people are not aware of it. Which raises another point that is a serious problem for us. And we talk about, an awakened movement and, the minority that's resisting, that sort of thing. But there are other major problems. The biggest problem we face right now is population demoralization, drug addiction, ill health, and mass disorientation. So it's not clear whether the masses of people are really ready to resist anymore. They're not really in a position. They're still trying to put their lives together again after lockdowns. The amount of vaccine injury, the amount of in the U.S. people put on an average of 25 pounds, during lockdowns. The amount of overdoses and suicides. So the population in general has been completely abused, and the amount of learning loss that took place over the 2 years with the schools being shut down is enormous. I mean, we're seeing the IQ levels of a whole generation just sinking. People can't read, they can't do math, they're unaware of literature. So this is the problems we're facing are immense, way larger than just something like a simple perspective from the past could solve. And what that transition looks like between where we are today and the start of a new renaissance is still unclear. How do we get from here to there? I just don't know. But it feels like an intellectual war, but it's also a real war, because there are many, many people on the other side where we stand on this stuff. And you'll notice in neither the UK nor the US have we seen any real frank, honest apologies for what's happened. And that's for a reason, because they're not sorry. They have every intention of doing it again. It's the best thing that ever happened to them. So this is what we're dealing with. Profound. I don't mean to, cast gloom here, because I think this can be defeated, but it's not going to be defeated. It's not. Our victory is not inevitable. I guess that's my point. The presumption of inevitability is where we went wrong. At least that's where I went wrong. And you're right. I was a child of the Cold War. When the end of history was announced in 1990, I thought it was true. and it wasn't true. It turns out history didn't end. History just moved along in its plodding ways exactly as it had in the past. So we have a job to do, and it's a terrifying one.
History moves along in plodding ways, but how'd you go bankrupt? Very gradually, then very quickly. History moved like that. Because I grew up like you during the Cold War, and I looked at this geopolitical situation where everything was locked down. It was frozen in a moment, and that moment was 1947. And nothing had really changed. And when I was going through my formative years, it looked like nothing ever would change. And then all of a sudden, it was all swept away. In one summer, when a few Germans started to get out through Hungary, and the whole lot just fell apart. And it's only organisations like the Mises Institute and what have you been discussing fee and what have you, discussing why. Because you had a society based wholly on fear, and when Gorbachev announced that they weren't going to do fear anymore, everything collapsed. And that kind of simple analysis, but that actually sees through to what's happening. There must be an equivalent for that for us, because we look at this society and it doesn't make sense. It's not rational. It's not reasonable. It's not reasoned. It's not precise. It's not scientific. It's not anything. It's got this strange belief system, and if you just believe enough and you comply enough, everything will be fine. But everything's not fine. Think, well, that must have an end. And to be in a position where you are doing what the Brownstone Institute is doing, which is putting out analysis, thoughtful, carefully reasoned explanations of what reality is, this can have a huge effect. It's not the sort of effect that the hegemon might fear, but well, maybe it is, because one of the things we were talking on the news program that we run on a regular basis, we're talking on Monday about a number of things where you had different aspects of the hegemon, and they were coming up. What's the big problem? So the Club of Rome, the biggest problem we face is the ability of the population to tell the difference between fact and fiction. Right? What they're saying is, we are terrified of not being able to carry a narrative. When they mean fact from fiction, they're reversing it, they mean fiction from fact. Right? They are terrified of not being able to win the narrative war. And we're seeing the same thing coming out of the UN. They've got their 12 or whatever it is, 12 plans for their Summit 2024. One of them is all about media and information and controlling the narrative. And when they're talking about this is about third on the list. It's right up near the top. What are the problems we face? Controlling ideas. And what the Brownstone Institute is doing is putting out ideas. What we're trying to do is put out ideas. And I actually think the hegemon is genuinely worried by that, because it does rely on the ideas being suppressed. And they have to keep suppressing them because you can have hope floats kind of thing. If you've got a viewpoint that says, well, actually, we can organise ourselves. We don't need the government to be doing everything for us. We don't need handouts. We can work for ourselves. We can take care of those who can't. That sort of idea that there's an option, there's an alternative to this kind of strange semi-slavery that we all seem to be expected to enjoy. The idea that there are other ways of looking at the world, the idea that there are other ways of analysing the problems, I think really worries the powers that shouldn't be. And can be tremendously effective. It worked in terms of the communism, which came down because the ideas ultimately failed. Can work again. And one of the things that I saw quite early during the battle, the war over COVID, and it was a war. It felt like a war. Quite early on, I mean, a good 18 months before lockdowns ended and everything was was stopped. I was looking at what was coming out, and I said, they've lost the narrative. They've lost the argument. Masking, social distancing, vaccine effects, vaccine safe and effective, the threat that that COVID-19 posed in the first place, all of it. They've lost the arguments. They've lost the narrative. They've lost. It's now only a matter of time till they close all the COVID stuff down. And it took another 18 months before we got shot of the last of it. But they had lost the argument. And I think that's no small thing, that weak and too small and too late and too pathetic though the opposition was, we still won the argument.
Right. And partially we won it because it had failed so badly. So let's just kind of review very quickly what was the plan. I mean, we've heard a lot of flim-flam, for many years now about all this stuff. That the purpose of lockdowns was to make the virus go away, make it scared, and eradicate it or something. I don't know. It's not clear what the purpose of lockdowns were. And then we had this, this wild spreading of germophobia throughout the population. Don't get near me. And by the way, it's still going on in the U.S. I mean, there was somebody. I was at a store, I guess 2 days ago, and a lady with an N95 mask was hopping around, avoiding me in the meat section. I was like, are you still trying to avoid COVID even now? You know what I'm saying? No, everybody got it. But as best I can tell, the idea was initially that there was a new virus and that they would terrify the population, even though we knew the infection fatality rate was extremely low and was focused on the elderly and infirm. We knew this. But they thought they would terrify the entire population, and then they would deploy their magic potion. So you lock everybody down, you reveal the magic potion, make everybody get it. They're protected from the evil germ. The whole population is deeply grateful and celebrates the glories of pharma and government and the media and big tech. And then we give them all power, and out of which they create vaccine passports, because God knows, look, we got fixed up and by the inoculations, and now we'll defer to you no matter what you say. So now government and pharma and media and big tech, they have all power. Now they can implement their global vaccine passports, and we have a health police everywhere. And we all just line up periodically for our inoculations from the government. So I think that was the plan. So the question is, where did it go wrong? And I think where the plan went wrong was that the vaccines didn't work. I mean, it's an amazing level of failure. And the incredible thing about this is that when the lockdowns happened and people started talking about vaccine, I just laughed, because I had read textbooks on virology and immunology and epidemiology. I understand how these viruses work. I know that there are some viruses that are stable, like polio and measles and rubella or whatever. And there are some pathogens that are constantly on the move. They have many changes of clothes. They can go to the wardrobe and pull down a new dress, a new suit any day of the week. And those kind of pathogens, there's never been any successful there's never been a successful vaccine against them. And we know this. And we've had many years of experience with the flu vaccine. And the typical seasonal flus are far more stable than something like a coronavirus, But even those, I mean, they're variously 20%, 30% effective, and sometimes 10%, sometimes 40%. But it's a guessing game, one year to the next, what the flu vaccine is going to be. I knew for sure there was no way they were going to be able to defeat a coronavirus and end this pandemic, if there was a pandemic, through vaccination. So if I knew that, and I'm hardly a specialist, I find it just amazing that governments and pharma and a ruling class in general believed that this cockamamie scheme could ever work. Well, it didn't work. It failed. It was the most immense failure I mean, it's a failure on the level of the failure of communism. I mean, it was a complete disaster. So now, faced with this failure, you've got a problem. You can admit it and say, okay, we lied, we were wrong, we're stupid, we're not experts, we flopped, we ruined your life for nothing. They could say that, but they're not going to say that. They never say that. So now we're in this kind of long period of pretend. They have to pretend as if they did the right thing and that there's some good to come out of it. But you're right. These days, nobody believes this anymore. So we're in this kind of strange moment in which in which the ruling class that did this to us continues to pretend as if all is fine, but actually not all is fine. The world's on fire. And they have lost all credibility. I mean, I was looking at a poll this morning about the collapse in trust in governments and media and medicine, in big business, in churches that went along with the lockdowns. And so like every institution in society has major institution of society, there's a mass loss of trust in everyone who participated in this. So I don't know how this ends, but I agree with you that this is not sustainable. And the best way that we can combat it is by working in the world of ideas, which is why the censorship is so intense right now. They're trying to keep our message from getting out. And they're attacking us in many other ways. I mean, Brownstone's under attack every single day. And people try to fact check us, and discredit us, block us. I mean, we've had to build huge machinery in place to keep us from being canceled. It's quite a struggle.
The change in people is quite striking. On the change in their willingness to believe the narrative. There's a wonderful British Twitter account called Dr. McHonk Honk, which is a man with dressed up as a clown, digitally dressed up as a clown, and he's the doctor, and there's another chap dressed up as a monkey, and he's the patient, and it's the interaction between the two. And it's very good stuff. It's very funny, and it's very hard-hitting. And the one that came out just recently, the doctor was complaining about no one's believing us anymore, and he listed all of the things that the state is trying to push, from the Ukraine war to global boiling to whatever. There's a range of them, and all of the deniers that are not buying this. The more we push it, the fewer people who believe us, and this is correct, right? The word expert has actually been devalued, right? Expert now means person who lies for money, and it's been devalued in the public's eyes to an incredible degree. And this has got to be replaced with something, right? Because there's a void now, right? So the challenge is that we get people to think and analyse themselves and trust their God-given ability to think and reason and ask questions and listen to other people's questions and have something that's more vibrant, more, if you want to say, 16th, 17th century Edinburgh review about it, which I think the Brownstone publication is. This will make headway. I'd like to finish off with it, just to go a little bit into your past, because I've been following your work for a long time, and I understand that even before I was watching what you were doing, you were working with Ron Paul. I wonder if you could just share a few thoughts on those days and with the Mises Institute with our audience before we go about the sort of work that they were doing and what you got from those associations.
Well, when I was in college, I was my first 2 years of college were kind of a waste for me because I had a full-time job and another part-time job. I was a musician in a band, and my full-time job was managing a men's store and that sort of thing. In my studies, I paid no attention to them. But I finally, in my third and fourth year, I transferred colleges, went to a small college, and had some professors who were good mentors to me, and I didn't have to work, and I spent all my time in the library reading anything and everything, and I got enraptured with just generally the world of ideas, and I didn't really have you know um, a fixed position on anything, which is good. When you're a student, you shouldn't. Um, but that Ron Paul was running, I think, for president. Actually, and this was really early on, and I was just intrigued about the clarity of his thinking and how different he sounded from everybody else. And I thought, that's kind of cool, and I kind of want to believe what he believes. So I started writing papers on the gold standard and this kind of stuff. So I went off to journalism school afterwards, and then Ron tapped me through several layers of friends to be his research assistant, which was a wonderful time for me. And I would spend all my time running monetary figures, just doing everything I loved, using my economics training, working for Ron. And he's a great man. He by the way, he was fantastic on COVID from the very beginning. Actually, he was one of the very few voices, and boy did he get slammed. But when I was in Washington, I bumped into the Mises Institute. I had already read, I guess 5 books by Mises by this time. So to discover that there was a Mises Institute, and don't forget, this is long before the internet existed, so it was hard to find out anything. I walked in and started volunteering, and eventually I stayed at the Mises Institute for 25 years actually, and had a publishing program and took it into the internet age and so on, and really learned a lot there, and then moved on from there to private company with financial company and publishing, and fee with publishing, and AIR with publishing. So it's been a sort of a long road for me. But as I look back on the course of my life and my many books that I've written and many things I've done, I feel like everything that's ever happened to me prepared me for what I'm doing right now. I write every day for the Epoch Times, every day, and then also run Brownstone. And so every skill I've ever developed over the course of my life, I'm deploying right now in the best way I know how. And I feel like I've made myself finally very, very useful in the greatest crisis of our lifetimes. So I feel a great deal of gratitude for my long experience in these industries, in the world of ideas, and I hope to continue. I hope using whatever skills I have in a responsible and effective way. I don't want to look back as Mises did when he was 6 years old, coming over on a boat from Geneva to the United States, coming to a country where he didn't really speak the language. He had no money, and he'd left all of his papers and books in Austria, where they were confiscated, first by the Nazis and then by the communists. And he wrote his memoirs as if he was at the end of his life. And he said, I set out to be a reformer and only became a historian of decline. So I think about that line a lot. And I don't want to be a historian of decline. I do feel the need to chronicle the disasters of our times and lay them out and explain them. But I hope to do so in a way that inspires a restoration of freedom and a new appreciation of human rights, and a restructuring of the social and political order in a way that returns power to the people. I'm not entirely sure what that looks like. I'm not entirely confident we can win this, but I agree with you that battling it out in the world of ideas stands the greatest hope of success. I'd rather have the power of ideas on my side than all the armaments in the world, because ideas have a magical ability to spread, they're malleable, they're free. And so I think we're going about this the best possible way. In any case, I'm not willing to accept defeat. I'm ready to battle it out, and that's what we do every single day. And I appreciate having you as a colleague in this great effort.
Well, sometimes when I'm asked, why do you do this, I point to the great Scottish hero, Robert Bruce. And he said, you never declare peace with the English. You can have a temporary truce, but you never make peace. And the reason he said that was, if you make peace within a generation, you'll lose the ability to resist. And why do you fight all of these evils we've talked about? You fight them in order to maintain the ability to resist. Because that alone, that's enough. Because in that there's hope. In that there's always a way forward. And if we become too comfortable, then all of a sudden, then great things can be taken from us. And I think being in the fight, being in the battle of ideas, and not being too comfortable, and not being too confident, and being realistic about the challenges is a great place to be. And I want to thank you very much, Jeffrey, for your time today. Have you anything you'd like to say just before we go?
No, apart from appreciate your interviewing style, letting me talk, and asking me some really interesting questions and allowing me to reflect a little bit on the bigger pictures. It's been really gratifying, so I appreciate it very much.
Jeffrey Tucker, thank you very much. Till next time, I hope. Goodbye.